It's often said that love and hate are two sides of the same coin. And I felt this strongly a while back when I made a video about how an extremely ordinary moment of online abuse turned into a fascinating debate about objectivity in art. It all started when I received a less than encouraging comment comparing the quality of my script to AI generated content. Usually I wouldn't have bothered reacting, but the fact this particular guy was verified and so didn't meet the profile of your average troll piqued my curiosity, and being firmly situated in the toilet
here it comes,
in the midst of an explosive standalone episode sponsored by Indian food, I had naught else to do. So I responded, and to my surprise, the result wasn't a further onslaught of insults, but an argument that sparked a philosophically interesting conversation about the nature of artistic expression. You see, his main issue of my video was that, in his view, my analysis lacked objectivity and dripped with bias. Not only did the core of my argument refuse to acknowledge the many objective problems that the game I was covering suffered from, but this represented such a denial of reality that my content came across as though it had not been created by a human being capable of critical thought. This might seem at first to be nothing special, a drop in the ocean of hate, but when I read through his critique, I realized that underneath the vitriol was a passionate philosophical defense of objective standards in art. So I, drawn in by the opportunity to feel smarter by debating art philosophy, saw this convo as a great chance to really investigate this debate. But looking back, I didn't put the time and effort in proportion to the gigantic scale of this debate in the original video. So here I am. The question of whether we can define artistic quality is an age-old debate that can be split into two main ideological groups: believers in subjectivity versus objectivity. As any terminally ugly person constantly repeats, subjectivity is the idea that beauty is in fact in the eye of the beholder. Adherents of this theory say that our perspective on quality in any medium or form simply depends too heavily on where we are raised and who we surround ourselves with for any universal standards to be established. Why can't a toilet be considered in the same conversation as a universally renowned work of beauty like the Mona Lisa? Believers in objectivity would say, because this sounds... These theorists believe we have an innate understanding of what is good, bad and in between based on our shared human nature. Therefore, if we just advanced our understanding of humanity, we could bring forth a universal consensus on quality according to standards that we all share. So in other words, autism. Now this comment reflected a typical trap true believers in the objective perspective fall into. The idea that our preferences represent some sort of universal truth. Yes, I will be the first to say that subjectivity out of control, like in the toilet example, essentially deprives meaning from our shared cultural experiences for reasons I'll get onto later. But we're not robots. Our perception of reality and preferences are simply too driven by our environment and emotions to prove one person's opinion on art is objectively wrong or right. Of course, biology plays a role, so in the same way there's a range of emotions we can feel, there is also a range of aesthetics we can tolerate. But our biology is intertwined with so many distinct environmental factors that it's nigh impossible to find a universal consensus on what works and what doesn't, which would be the standard you need to prove objectivity. Now I can easily demonstrate this by deconstructing some of the commentators' specific issues of my critique. The main issue he had with my review was that I neglected to recognize the flaws that objectively brought down the quality of the title I was covering. You see, in his view, the internet had come to the consensus that the game I was covering lacked replay value and compared to its spiritual predecessors, suffered from poor boss design, and that these flaws were so glaring it was simply absurd to view it as a 10 out of 10. Now at face value, this sounds like a decent take, but it falls into a classic trap of mistaking one's inherently biased value judgment for a universal standard. My mind can go off track sometimes, understandably. Anyways, while he might place a high premium on replayability, others will not care or even value a more linear experience because of the distinct first impression they create. And there is no way to prove either opinion right or wrong. Many fruits of life are sweetest when consumed for the first time. So who are we to tell someone that their opinion is wrong because the game doesn't have 600 hours of distinct content, or vice versa? And this will never be resolved as long as game development requires developers to make trade-offs between different features. You see, in reality, devs aren't magicians, unrestrained by the limitations of the physical world. They don't have unlimited access to expertise, time, and money. Often the complete opposite. Game development is a notoriously difficult and unstandardized process, often subject to constant fluctuations in timelines and budgets. So making difficult choices on what to prioritize and what to not comes with the territory for even the most innovative developers. Larian's road to their magnum opus Baldur's Gate 3 is a perfect example of this process. The blueprint for their masterpiece emerged with perhaps their most revolutionary game, Divinity: Original Sin. By the time of its release, classic CRPGs still held a lot of appeal, but it didn't take a rocket scientist to tell that the pause real-time model carried with it a lot of limitations to the accessibility and strategic possibilities of gameplay in the modern era. Josh Sawyer, the man who directed the beloved CRPG nostalgia revival Pillars of Eternity, even said as much himself. In a recent video, he admitted that he always had a nagging suspicion that turn-based was the way to go, and Baldur's Gate was the final straw. In fact, the Pillars series is only limited to old systems due to fan pressure, not his preference. But while Larian's willingness to contradict CRPG orthodoxy was a much needed and bold move, the formula established to achieve all this also came with certain distinct limitations. Their focus on polishing the Divinity Original Sin formula also permanently enshrined some of the trade-offs established by this formula. Like, the lack of focus on creating distinctive and original art. Let's be honest, the design of Faerun isn't particularly unique or imaginative. Most areas have a very limited color palette, often reflecting standard medieval fantasy tropes. Mind flayers are just mini Cthulhus, and the city itself looks like Florence with weird large toy soldiers everywhere. Now, I personally don't care about these trade-offs because I believe it allowed Larian to expend their time and effort working out how to bring the level of freedom and creativity found within tabletop formulas to life, a sacrifice I'll take any day. But if someone primarily wants an atmospheric experience that conjures a unique sense of adventure, then Baldur's Gate 3 would not be a masterpiece to them. And there is no way of objectively proving either opinion wrong. Now, after all this, I'm sure you're assuming that the debate's over, checkmate. How could he possibly disprove the subjectivity of art? And of course, you'd be right, but there's a reason the video doesn't end here. You see, he decided to respond again after I disproved his point. And instead of reiterating the same logic over and over again, he did something interesting. He tried to direct my very logic against me. He said, surely if objectivity doesn't exist, then the very premise of my channel doesn't either. Why produce content meant for others that judges quality and pushes for certain norms in game design if there is no such thing as objective standards? Doesn't the very willingness of people to listen to my channel disprove that very theory? To be honest, when I heard this, I was a little flawed. I knew objective standards couldn't be proved, but I also had the nagging feeling that by flipping my logic on me, he had hit something on the nail. So I sat down and reflected for a bit, and after a period of recalibration, a revelation sprung into my head. I realized that he was wrong, but had inadvertently touched on why the objective perspective holds so much appeal: our need for meaning. You see, his new argument rested on a single assumption, that for debate around quality to have meaning, it must be centered around a universal common ground. Otherwise, the conversation would lack purpose, and without purpose is essentially pointless. The assumption that for all our choices and preferences to have heft, they must draw on an objective meaning gets to the core of our nature. In many ways, our search for meaning defines us as human beings. We have an intrinsic need to feel as though our actions have a purpose beyond ourselves to be convinced of their importance. This is why religion has such a broad appeal, and why the idea of subjective morality seems flaky and almost somewhat dangerous. Throughout history, many have thought that if we don't have a grounding in some sort of consensus, order would break down as everyone pursued their own mutually incompatible version of the good life in conflict with one another. Now, obviously the stakes involved in these debates among gamers or painters aren't existential, although many react as though they are. But the logic used by the religious against the atheistic mirrors the logic used by believers in objective artistic quality against advocates of the subjective, and when analysed seems to form similar motifs. You see, much like the religious man, the believer in objective laws of game design fears that without universal consensus on standards, there will be none. In other words, they lean on objective language to give their arguments power. Now, I'm not here suggesting that angry gamers are somehow power-hungry maniacs, because that's obviously true. Why point out the obvious? I'm joking, of course, I'm joking. Calm down. Don't get too angry, that would ironically prove the point. But overall, no one can deny they do want their voice to have some extra weight to it. We all do. And to do so, their subconscious calls on them to draw from a source that no one can dispute. A kind of higher authority that determines what is good and what is Ubisoft. This is why I hear objective language most often utilized by those who are against the AAA developer zeitgeist, because they are the most desperate. And don't get it twisted, I understand why. It seems that at every corner the big companies are finding new ways to monetize, simplify, and cheapen gaming. Loot boxes, excessive in-game monetization, exclusivity, and unreasonable price hikes are becoming staples, and sometimes it feels like we're a few NFTs away from the brink. So I get why some would want to fight against the powerful economic incentives of the industry by adopting the right righteous language of objectivity. But I still think there is a question as to whether the ends justify the means. Yes, strategically, it's very convincing, but as the comment highlights, it cheapens the public conversation and promotes ignorance. This language only has power if most people are simply unself-aware, unable to distinguish between rhetorically useful objective language designed to give power to their voice and the subjective reality art exists in. How many comments are there saying this game's crap, or you're an idiot, or you're a mouth breather thinking this, not realizing that their opinion is just that, an opinion. But even with this, you could still say we need this illusion to find common ground and enforce certain standards. Surely if there is no universal principle of design, a company cannot be criticized for creating a buggy mess or add in more variety of loot boxes than stars in the universe. And certain features like multiplayer might be prioritized over creating quality single player experiences. But I believe it's possible to organize communities to push for certain standards as long as you recognize one key aspect of subjectivity. It isn't a free-for-all. People brought up in similar cultures with similar personalities and similar gaming experiences growing up naturally form fairly similar ideas about quality that almost become enshrined as permanent in their mind. In the same way that even in highly irreligious societies, morality still tends to divide cleanly among generational, cultural and class lines. Just think of your parents. Do they have fairly consistent and largely unshakable views about migrants? I imagine yes. In Britain we call that the Brexit vote. And this is why we can still form communities and have power in numbers without objectivity. Sharing a similar subjective reality with one another is enough. And while rhetorically objective language is necessary, sometimes we are brought together by subjectivity, whether we like to believe that or not. Gamers don't get together to critique Bethesda's game design or lack thereof, and EA's continued sleaziness because they have a superior understanding of standards versus the masses. They get together because they are similar people from similar backgrounds and thus have similar preferences. And so all we need to debate what works and what doesn't is agreement on certain fundamentals. For example, if I'm arguing with another guy and we both claim that naturalistic dialogue is better, but he reps Dirty Grandpa and I back Pulp Fiction, there's no question who won. But if he said he much prefers films by old movie stars desperate to scrape together enough money to fund their lifestyle after the 5th divorce, we wouldn't share any common ground, and so Dirty Grandpa wins. A good example of an argument that doesn't rely on objectivity is many a true nerd's defense of Fallout 3 in his magnum opus, Fallout 3 is better than you think. In this video, he doesn't try to draw on objective standards to explain why he believes Fallout 3 is unfairly maligned in the gaming discourse, but instead, he uses his opponent's logic against them, showing how by their own parameters, Fallout 3 is better than they claim. When H-Bomber Guy argues that Fallout 3's prologue is worse than New Vegas's because it offers very little choice, many a true nerd lists off the myriad choices that players have in Fallout 4 versus New Vegas. But if H-Bomber Guy's argument wasn't quantifiable or based on a fundamental disagreement, then many a true nerd would not be able to directly challenge his logic, only offer an alternative perspective. Like and subscribe if you like this video, and if you didn't, remember, no refunds on your time.